Okay, everyone, I think we can get going in a minute. And I see you've organized yourselves like one of my classes, everyone avoiding the front rows. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Jim Hirschberg. I'm the former Bwifshi director of the Cold War International History Project here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to the event entitled A Long Goodbye, the Soviet Withdrawal from Afghanistan, to mark the publication of the eponymous book by Artemy Kalinovsky, who is two spaces over to my right. Artemy is currently teaching at the University of Amsterdam. Prior to that, he did his dissertation at the London School of Economics and Politics on this subject. And before that, I'm proud to say he was an undergraduate at George Washington University, where I teach, and I'm very proud to have known him since then and to see all of the things he has been doing. Artemy's book, let me just say at the outset, is a sterling contribution to the scholarship on the War of Afghanistan. I thought I had known what there was to know in terms of the emerging evidence from the Soviet archives, at least that which had made its way into English over the first 10 or 15 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Artemy got deeper through oral history research, through scouring of archives, through contacts he made in Moscow and elsewhere. And he really brings to this tale some very new insights and information that will surprise, I think, even many experts on the subject. So Artemy will speak first, and then as a commentator, we're honored to have Ambassador Peter Thompson. As the Soviets pulled out and the immediate aftermath of that was taking place in Afghanistan from 1989 to 1992, Ambassador Thompson was the American special envoy to Afghanistan with the rank of ambassador for President George H.W. Bush. And he has a book coming out too, The Wars of Afghanistan, which will be coming out in July from Public Affairs, and he will have some comments. But we will start first with Artemy, then Peter, and then we will open up to the floor for comments and questions. So let me hand it over to Artemy.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, what was the purpose of writing this book? I wanted to do a study of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in a broad sense, and began by studying the decision-making from the beginning of the war to its end. But the more I did that, the more I found I needed to look deeper and broader. And so what I've tried to do is talk a bit about the way the war is fought, the diplomacy surrounding the war, various elements of what we would call counterinsurgency, meaning economic development, building up native security forces, and so forth, and also to go into what happens after the withdrawal. Because, of course, you can't evaluate the success of a policy until you see what some of the after effects are. Now, what is this war about, the Soviet-Afghan war, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan? Well, it depends on your perspective. From the point of view of Soviet leaders, this is very much a defensive war. Yes, it comes at the end of a decade where the Soviet Union has had some spectacular successes in the Third World. But it's also one where they've had significant setbacks. Okay, in the success column, of course, you can put Angola, the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, Ethiopia going over to the Soviet camp, at one point Somalia going over to the Soviet camp. But in terms of the failures, again, Egypt abandoning the Soviet camp after almost 20 years of Soviet investment there, and Somalia and Ethiopia, their relations deteriorating, and Somalia ultimately going to the U.S. camp. And of course, again, in terms of successes, détente, crucial for the Soviet leaders who are looking for a sense of stability and security in Europe, being able to avoid the fear of nuclear war, recognition of their position. But again, that's something that by the end of the 1970s is starting to fall apart a bit. So for them, at the end of the 1970s, the international situation is deteriorating. And when they view the events in Afghanistan that are taking place then, which I'll get to in a minute, that's the prism, that's the context that they see it in. For the United States, it's a bit different. When the Soviet intervention happens, it's seen as another example of Soviet aggression, another example of Soviet advance in the Third World, disregard for the principles of détente. For Pakistan, this is about projecting influence in a country with which it's had troubled relations since the 1950s, but also for an avowedly religious president, Zia-ul-Haq, this is about dealing a blow to a secular, anti-religious government. Now, from the Soviet side, I think it has an element of tragedy, not in the sense that, I mean, the whole story is tragic, but tragedy in the sense of Greek tragedy, where you know the outcome almost at the beginning. Not to suggest that everybody knew when and how the Soviets were going to withdraw. But one of the things we learned in the 1990s through declassification and interviews and investigative reporting and ultimately a history of the intervention that was written, is that when the Soviets are first asked to intervene in March 1979, in the debate that takes place, Soviet leaders list all of the things that can go wrong if they do that. They'll end up fighting the Afghan people. They won't be able to explain the intervention to Soviet citizens. It'll cause much greater tensions with the United States and with European countries, so on and so forth. I mean, all of these things happen, and they are aware of all the risks. But when they do intervene, it's largely because they feel they have no choice. So I'll go through the narrative a bit, which will probably be familiar to many of you, but perhaps not to all of you. In 1978, a communist government, a group of communists is able to take power in Kabul. Can't really quite call it a revolution. It's more of a coup by circumstance when the sort of secular but non-aligned government of Mohammed Daoud tries to get rid of the communists in Kabul. They are able to turn the army against them and take power. Soon after that, they get involved in a lot of internal fighting within the party, and by March 1979 are facing their first major uprising in the city of Herat. And that's when they ask the Soviets to intervene militarily to put it down. The Soviets don't, and the Afghans are able to deal with it themselves. Summer and fall of that year, the rivalry between the two leaders between the two of them have now eliminated a whole sort of wing of the party, at least pushed it out of any kind of position of influence. Their rivalry is getting out of control. One of them is killed despite getting support from the Soviets. The other one, Hafizullah Amin, knows he's distrusted by the Soviets. The relations worsen. They suspect that he may also be meeting with U.S. officials, so on and so forth. Let me pause a minute and sort of ask the question, what is an Afghan communist? Except a contradiction in terms. For me to understand them, I had to sort of, the best way I think to compare them is to think about the Russian intelligentsia of the 19th century. These are a group of people in a very poor country, underdeveloped country, who are among the first to really get a Western education, a lot of the privileges that the modernization of their country gives them. But it also makes them much more critical of the limited reforms that are taking place in that country in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it pushes them to ever more radical solutions. Among the things they share, aside from this desire for something more radical, is also great faith in what the Soviet Union can do to achieve the kind of modernization that they want. One of the things I learned from my oral history interviews with a former young communist activist, when she was starting to doubt the relationship with the Soviet Union, this is before the revolution, she went to the person who would later become the prime minister of this government, and she expressed her doubts, and he said, you have to understand that a mosquito north of the border, meaning the Soviet Union, is a jet plane for us. You know, this was the kind of attitude that these people had towards the Soviet Union. And of course, it makes sense then that as soon as they get into trouble, they are asking the Soviets to intervene. So, to get back to 1979, this is the situation that the Soviets are facing on their southern border. Something that should have been favorable to their interests, a communist revolution, a very pro-Soviet government there, is actually becoming very much the opposite. And the country seems to be sliding into chaos. Again, SALT II fails in Congress that summer. The Iranian Revolution turns increasingly anti-American, which on the one hand makes them happy, but it also makes them paranoid that the United States now is going to take advantage of the situation. Well, to try to make up for the fact that it's lost Iran, is going to be looking to take advantage of the situation in Afghanistan. Decision to place missiles in West Germany. All of these things add up to the point where the top Soviet decision makers feel like they have no choice except intervention by December 1979, because either the country is going to fall apart completely, obviously a threat to the Soviets on their southern border, or it'll somehow become a U.S. base. And what they're hoping to do is that if they replace the most radical people in this government, put in somebody more moderate, Babrak Karmal is the person that they end up choosing. That person will unify the party, roll back the most controversial reforms, gradually normalize the situation. And they don't expect to actually do much of the fighting. What they're hoping to do is, send their troops to guard the bases, let the Afghan troops go out and deal with any disturbances. And at first, that's more or less what happens, but the situation lasts only a few weeks. It's been common now, in the newspapers you see every spring, oh, the fighting season is about to begin, the fighting season has begun. I mean, I think the Soviets maybe were lulled into a false sense of success or when they intervened in December 1979, because things were fairly calm for the first month or two. But then, of course, they very quickly started to deteriorate. And the Afghan military turned out to be insufficient, was not performing very well. And so very quickly, it's the Soviets who are doing the fighting in Afghanistan, and that's a situation that lasts all the way up to 1988, 1989. Still, at the time of the intervention, the hope is that this is a short-term affair, 6 months, a year. These are the kind of time frames that are being discussed. But the problem is, now that the Soviets are in Afghanistan, all the problems that were there before are still there, except now the stakes are higher because the Soviet troops are the ones doing the fighting, because the Soviets have taken sort of much more responsibility on, much harder. Now they really can't be seen to fail. Now, another interesting thing looking at these early years is how quickly people are raising their heads to say this is a war that cannot be won militarily. And we're not just talking here about liberals within the Communist Party, scholars who maybe have connections to the party, who are saying these things as well. But it's very easy to sort of ignore them. By the end of 1980-81, this is coming from military on the ground, from the top brass. A lot of them were against the intervention in the first place, but of course they carry out their orders. But now they're becoming increasingly vocal about saying, look, you can't win this situation militarily. You need to find some kind of political solution. And eventually they're even able to get the Minister of Defense to listen to them, to get on their side. And he's one of the initial interventionists. The other thing is that on a military level, the Soviets do adjust very well. They're not prepared for the kind of fight that they get into initially, because, of course, Soviet military is oriented towards either fighting a nuclear war or a war in Europe. But they do adjust. Training is adjusted to reflect local realities. There's greater use of special forces, and so on. So then, if they realize so early that the war cannot be won militarily, why does it take 10 years to get out? Well, I think there's 4 paradigms, if you will, at work when it comes to the USSR's involvement and slowness to disengage from the conflict. And here I'm going to get very broad. The first is the importance of the Third World for the Soviet Union and for how Soviet leaders view their own and their country's status. By the 1970s, aid to the Third World is a key component of the Soviet state's legitimacy as a superpower. On the one hand, you have the position in Europe. That's justified by the defeat of fascism, which is frequently recounted in movies and books and monuments and demonstrations. But its position as a world power is justified, at least in part, by its defense of emerging states against encroaching neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, led, of course, by the United States. So the possible effect of a defeat in Afghanistan on the Soviet Union's reputation, that's a concern not only of the people who decide for intervention in the late 1970s and 1979, like Leonid Brezhnev, like Yuri Andropov, but it's also a concern of many of the reformists that take power after 1985, not least of all Mikhail Gorbachev himself. Soviet leaders never see Afghanistan in isolation from the rest of their commitments and their relations with the Third World. And for this reason, among others, they feel they cannot tolerate a loss there. Secondly, for all their original skepticism about what they could do in Afghanistan, they do hold on to the belief that they can improve the situation there for a very long time. Moscow's presence is extended by its belief in what it can do to transform the country on behalf of its client regime. And if you read the book, or if you read about this elsewhere, I mean, you'll notice sort of parallels with Vietnam, with the current situation in Afghanistan. But Soviet leaders, they of course recognize that the Soviet example in general, the Soviet example of development, is not appropriate for Afghanistan. And they're not trying to make Afghanistan a 16th republic of the Soviet Union, despite what some people at the time believe. But they do think that if they provide the right mixture of political training and modernization programs and economic aid, that the Afghan people will see the regime in Kabul as legitimate, and so not support the opposition. And so to this end, they sent thousands of party advisors to help the Afghan Communist Party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, improve its organizational work, gain support in the countryside. But as I show in the book, these advisors often do more harm than good, in part because they're woefully prepared for the kind of work they're sent to do. And so, as a result, even though they're not supposed to be doing this, they just replicate their experience in the Soviet Union. Other kinds of advisors are sent in as well. Some are working specifically on economic projects, infrastructure projects. Others are working with intelligence and so forth. But even after those are withdrawn in 1986, Moscow continues to try to reform its programs. Policy of national reconciliation is introduced in this period, which is an attempt by Moscow to get involved in sort of bringing the fighting parties together in Afghanistan. And the reason that I say that this is actually prolonging the withdrawal is because every time a new initiative is taken, you have this refrain of, yes, there are a lot of problems in Afghanistan, we do need to get out, but let's give this a chance to work. Third, despite a general consensus within the Soviet hierarchy on what Moscow goals in Afghanistan were, there's often very little coordination of the various groups that are working on Moscow's behalf in Kabul. Sharpest conflict that I found was between the Soviet military and the Soviet KGB. Officers of the two security forces take sides in the internal split within the Communist Party, the military supporting Halk, which is the faction that's dominant in 78, 79, and the KGB supporting Parcham, the faction that's sort of dominant after that. And these disagreements allow the Afghan communists to play the different sides off against each other and even to develop a lobby for their views in Moscow. And so when the Soviets are debating getting out, this is something that the Afghans who are against it or who want more military support are able to use. Finally, of course, the conflict is prolonged by the high level of Soviet-U.S. tensions in the 1980s. It's Pakistan that's delivering arms directly to the Mujahideen and training the Mujahideen who are fighting in Afghanistan. But it's U.S. money and resources that's crucial to keeping the fight going, with help, of course, from Saudi Arabia and China and several other countries. Soviet leaders believe that a settlement on Afghanistan is only going to be possible if the United States agreed to stop supporting the Mujahideen. But at the same time, because of how difficult relations with the United States were, particularly in those first years of the 1980s, they're very reluctant to open a dialogue with the U.S. And they fear also, particularly in the beginning, that opening a dialogue with the U.S. would be an admission they would be admitting that they made a mistake in intervening in the first place. Okay, what makes the withdrawal possible in the end? I believe it's a mixture of despair and hope. Despair about what the Soviets are ever going to accomplish in Afghanistan, and hope that the improving relations with the United States between Gorbachev and Reagan are going to make it possible to find a peaceful solution there. Gorbachev comes to power wanting to get out of Afghanistan. We know this. He jots it down in his notebook, apparently on his first day, that this is going to be a priority. But what he doesn't know is how to go about doing it. And he's going to spend several years trying to figure that one out. Although his goal is withdrawal, and he is, in his own way, fairly single-minded about pursuing it, the pattern he sets in motion is not all that different from his predecessors. For example, he wants to revive diplomacy, which between 1983 and 1885 is virtually moribund. And he hopes that he can get the U.S. and Pakistan to stop supplying the Mujahideen and make the Kabul government's life much easier. He changes the leader in Afghanistan. The person they put in 1980, Babrak Ramal, yes, he's more moderate, but they also feel that, well, there's rumors that he is very much a drinker, that he is not willing to be independent in taking decisions, that he's always looking to the Soviets for help, that he is in his own way actually very divisive. And so they want to change him. From 1983, they're looking for a replacement, and they put in someone named Najibullah, though at this period he goes by Najib because he doesn't want the Allah part there. Later he'll take back the Allah. Gorbachev tries to reform the effort in Afghanistan, meddling a bit with the military, pulling out a lot of non-military advisors, engaging much more extensively and forcefully in negotiations with the Mujahideen. This one, I think, is quite interesting. Of course, the Soviets do engage with different opposition leaders before 85, but what starts happening as they move into 1986, 87, with this policy of national reconciliation, is actually reaching out to the big leaders, people like Ahmad Shah Massoud, and trying to get them involved in some kind of settlement. But the pattern that is set here is that each time something is tried, there's this, well, we have to give it a chance to work. And so in 1985, Gorbachev says a year or two and we get out of there. And then in 1986, he says a year or two and we get out of there. In 1987, he says a year or two and we get out of there. And so in this way, again, the process is being extended. Now, nobody is against withdrawal in principle at this point, certainly, by 1985. But on the question of when to do it and on how to do it, there are disagreements. And one of the interesting things I found is that the debate breaks down on lines that are very different from those on other issues. Take, for example, Edvard Shevardnadze, Soviet foreign minister, somebody rightly, I think, credited with helping to end the Cold War. On Afghanistan, his position is much more, you could say, militant or conservative. He is the one in 87, 88 pushing for additional strikes against Mujahideen leaders. He's the one pushing for more solid commitment to Najibullah, not letting him down. He's being very emotional even in Politburo meetings when people are talking about withdrawal. There's, of course, the split between the military and the KGB that I mentioned previously. Neither of them, of course, are voicing support for staying in longer, but the KGB is trying to find ways that the Soviets can stay more involved, to even keeping some troops in after the withdrawal. The military is completely opposed to this. But there's also, I think, a split in Gorbachev's mind as well, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. He doesn't want to see the Soviet Union look like it's abandoning Afghanistan. He still believes in the Soviets' role in the Third World, even if he's interested in reforming it. So these issues, again, are important for understanding why it's not until 1988 that the withdrawal begins. But on the hope side, like I said, by 1987, late 1987, there's really been a breakthrough in relations with the United States. That's when, of course, you have first the Washington summit and then the Moscow summit in May 1988. And the hope, again, we see this in internal discussions, and what Gorbachev is saying to other people is, well, maybe now the Americans will see that they should be working with us on this, that they'll help us find a settlement there. And of course, Gorbachev gets virtually nothing from the United States on this. Gorbachev would like to be able to keep supporting the Najibullah without having the United States supporting the Mujahideen, and that doesn't happen. And I think, perhaps you can comment on this a bit later, one of the reasons being, and this does come up on the American side, is that, well, now it's very clear that they want to withdraw. Why should we give anything up? Now, let me talk very briefly then about the aftermath of withdrawal, and then I'll quit. When the withdrawal is complete, my sense is that most of the Soviet leadership is mentally prepared for the regime to collapse. And this is also the expectation of most foreign observers. But Najibullah is actually able to hold on. And he defeats a major attempt to knock his regime out at Jalalabad in March of 1989, and then he gains in stature from that point on. He does this by using Soviet economic aid and military aid, not Soviet troops, they're gone at this point, having a core sort of well-trained troops, plus paying off militias to fight on his behalf. And this is how he ends up holding on for the next several years. It's a sort of zombie state. I mean, it probably couldn't go on indefinitely, but the Soviets' hope is that he holds on long enough that the Mujahideen and the United States and Pakistan realize that you can't have a settlement in Afghanistan without this guy. I think that's what the Soviets are pushing for. Although they end up, I think, by the end of 1991, perhaps giving up on that. Within the Soviet Union, the withdrawal is generally well received. Gorbachev decides to open the door to reporting on the origins of the war and its conduct because he worries if the regime collapses, how do we explain what we've been doing there for the last 10 years? If the war was just unnecessary, why are we pulling out now? And so this results in a number of exposés focusing the blame on the Brezhnev leadership, but largely leaving Gorbachev himself out of it. By the way, one of the key journalists in this is somebody named Vladimir Snegirov. He was writing, I think, at this point for Вечерняя Москва, although he's been going to Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. He ends up writing the first book, I think, that really deals honestly with this issue in Russian. And he's just published another book on the 78-79 period, looking, I think, more deeply at this. I haven't seen it yet, but I suspect that it's going to be the first time we really see something new about the reasons for the Soviet intervention. Anyway, the withdrawal is probably the last uncontroversial thing that Gorbachev does, the thing that he gets virtually unanimous praise for. Everything he does after this, he's going to get attacked from the left, from the right, from every possible direction. A few final comments. Did the Afghanistan war play a significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union? I believe not. While it is true that the war helped expose many of the injustices of Soviet military life, as well as some of the shortcomings in the military in general, it did not critically undermine the military as an all-Soviet institution. Nor was it, the key criticism of the government in general or of the Soviet state in that period. Afghanistan actually doesn't come up all that much, either in Russia itself or even in some of the other republics. It comes up, but it's not, it's not the prime motivator there. Again, part of the reason, I think, is because the Soviets avoid a defeat in Afghanistan. Right? The Najibullah regime is still there. It actually almost looks like the Soviets have gotten what they wanted. And the regime is going to the Najibullah regime is actually going to outlast the Soviet Union by about 4 months. Could Najibullah have survived longer? I think if the Soviet Union had survived, then yes, possibly he could have. Again, like I said, what the Soviet leaders are hoping for is that he sticks around long enough for people to see that they can't avoid him. Now, would that be possible? I don't know. I hope Ambassador Thompson will talk a little bit about that himself. But in light of what's happened since in Afghanistan, I would say that it would have been preferable. That's it.
Thank you, Artemy. Very provocative and lots of questions. But first, let's have a commentary from Ambassador Thompson.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, and it's great to be here, to be back. I've been to other seminars. We were just discussing one in 2002 when Chernyayev and about 5 other Soviets, or ex-Soviets, came to the United States, and we had U.S. ambassadors, station chief Steve Cole was there, and it was an extremely productive conference. Well, first of all, I want to say that this indeed is, to use Jim's word, a sterling contribution, not only to scholarship on this period, Artemy, but also a contribution to the policy community inside and outside of government, actively making policy. Because fortunately, Artemy devoted a lot of the last paragraph to somewhat comparing today's predicament that the United States faces in Afghanistan, and he says some of the parallels, and he's quite right, are remarkable, quote unquote. Of course, there's many differences you could cite, as Artemy also says, but anybody interested in Afghanistan today really should read this book, because it's the most well-written, well-sourced book that I have seen on this period. I was in Moscow as a political officer in the political section when the Herat uprising took place. And as you were speaking, Artemy, I just recalled a cable I sent to Washington analyzing whether or not the Soviets would intervene. And at that point, they were not prepared to intervene. And those of you that have followed the literature on that uprising and the Politburo debates and the excellent Cold War International History Project booklets, that at the beginning of the debates, Gromyko gave an impassioned speech saying we cannot lose Afghanistan. Of course, at that point and later, Afghanistan, it was impossible to lose Afghanistan, even after the Soviet invasion, because they had never, nor had the PDPA, won Afghanistan. 90% of the population at the time lived in rural areas, and they never succumbed to either the PDPA regime or to the Soviet army when it came in. So, sort of in a broader picture, the Soviet Union, the PDPA, were never in control of most of Afghanistan, and when the Soviet army left, it was in less control of territory than it was in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. At any rate, I wrote this cable, and I was pleased to see in the documentation of the Cold War International History Project that the points that I made in the cable, they're not going to invade, at least now, were made in the ensuing debate. Andropov came in with a point that was either or, but it was more for let's not intervene. Of course, Kosygin and others at the table were arguing against helping the Afghans and responding to the call for help. Later on, though, of course, the Soviet Union, for the reasons Artemy mentioned, did invade. And also, it was very good of you to mention that Afghan communist is somewhat of a contradictory term. It's hard to find a real Afghan communist at heart, because it's still a tribal society and the values are very tribal even today. One leading book on this period is entitled Tribal Communism. The perspective of the Soviet Union was very Marxist, and you can say that it was focused sort of horizontally on layers of classes and class warfare. That was true to a certain extent of European intelligentsia too, and Chinese intelligentsia, even before the communist. But in Afghanistan's tribal society, I try to bring this out in my book, it's vertical. You have the head of the tribe or a leading tribal figure, and those that are under him, often the same bloodline. They are not horizontal, they're vertical. That's one of the reasons why the Afghan communist social reforms failed so badly on changing marriage laws, on distributing land, because not only the landowner, but those that worked for him considered that to be haram, thievery, to take away land from one person and give it to another. And your comment on moving from despair to attempting to move to get out and hope that it will work, that was pretty much the attitude of my colleague when I was DCM in China. His name was Vladimir Fedotov. He's a good friend of mine, and we spent many hours together, and our families did each other's dinner table. In '85, he was taking me aside at diplomatic receptions and saying, "Please help us get out. We've made a huge mistake." But then in April, after I was announced, actually he came over to see me and he said, "I'm sorry I can't invite you to a farewell dinner because of what you're going to be doing. But he also warned me that things were not as the American analysts were saying at the time, CIA and even State Department, the intelligence community, and some in the Soviet bureaucracy too, that Najib was going to fall. And he was convinced, and he was not putting something on. He believed that Najib would stay on, and that the Mujahideen would, and the analysis was right, the Mujahideen would fragment. But we can't go into that. That's too far in the future for Artemy's book. I must say, too, that your analysis and your description, your detail on the negative symmetry dialogue leading up to the Geneva Convention is the finest that I've ever seen in any publication, the toing and froing between the United States and the Soviet Union. I can't go, incidentally, negative symmetry is when both sides decide simultaneously to end arms transfers. Positive symmetry is when both sides continue, and that was a continuous debate all the way up to September 13, 1991, when we signed a agreement. Baker went to Moscow, and we signed a negative symmetry agreement. But that's another story too. There's a lot of new material in Artemy's book. A lot of new material which has never surfaced anywhere else, and that's, I think, because of his use of good use of Russian sources, especially Russian language sources like Karin Bruten's memoirs still hasn't been translated into English, and it's really, really an outstanding description of that period, the Soviet pre-invasion and then after the invasion. Now, you have talked about reasons to stay. I'm going to, for the time that I have here, concentrate especially on the constraints. Why the Soviet Union did not make progress. You also touched on this, of course, too, in the remarks that you just made, and it's covered quite comprehensively in your book. And you conclude that this was a period of drift because of that. And I agree with that. It was a period of drift. The Soviet moves after the decision in principle was made to withdraw in '85, up till the withdrawal, and I would say afterwards, was always tactical, reactive. They're short-term. It wasn't long-term, strategic. There was no grand design to get out, no attempt to make a comprehensive breakthrough, but just moving according to the events that took place, shifts in the Politburo, developments in Afghanistan with the Pakistanis and with the Americans. The main constraint, though, and I would say that's the main constraint for us today, too, and I developed this in my book, that is ignorance. Ignorance about Afghanistan's culture, society, and history. That both of us plunged into Afghanistan, especially our military bureaucracy, but also on the political side, the intelligence side, KGB, CIA, and even today, there is a great dearth of knowledge about Afghan society, and we're throwing money still at the problems. We're throwing resources, but things are getting worse. And the Soviets face the same dilemma as we do. And again, this is too deep a topic to go into, but Afghanistan is a very different country. And when you go into a context like Afghanistan, you have to have a good knowledge of the country to succeed, or to stave off failure at least. In the end, there was, of course, no breakthrough. That the Soviets just decided to build up the Afghan forces and leave, as Artemy mentioned, and the bottom line was to prevent the failure or the defeat of the Soviet army in Afghanistan and the appearance of a defeat in Soviet policy in Afghanistan. Not to lose Afghanistan was never in play in reality. I want to mention here, too, another constraint for success in Afghanistan, and that was the utter brutality of the Soviet army from the first months of the invasion in Afghanistan. This is a tribal society, and villages are organized along family, clan, tribal lines. And the imperative of badal, retribution, it just seems right through the, permeates the society. It's a requirement. Even if you die you have to try to achieve revenge for a slight done to you. And if you have artillery pounding your village and killing your family members and airstrikes, that moves you and your family or clan over to the resistance. I'm just going to quote from one line in Artemy's book and then move on to cite this brutality element, which cannot be, in my opinion, overestimated. This is a Soviet general speaking, a very high-ranking Soviet general. Almost 10 years of the war reflected, this was sort of a spasm of bombing and artillery along the Salang Highway north of Kabul about 3 weeks before the Soviets pulled out, causing untold casualties, civilian casualties mostly. Almost 10 years of the war reflected, as if in a mirror, in 3 days and 3 nights, political cynicism and military cruelty, the absolute defenselessness of some, and the pathological need to kill and destroy on the part of others. 10 years of blood bleeding were absorbed into those 3 days. So if you're talking about negotiations with the Afghans, and you want to find a major figure, political figure to negotiate with, it's hard to find one under these circumstances, because it would be political suicide for somebody like Massoud to seriously negotiate with the Soviet Union on a political settlement of the Afghan war, or even with Najib, who in Mujahideen eyes and Afghan eyes had betrayed the country and turned it over to the Soviet Union and the Soviet Army. Other constraints, Artemy mentioned the stovepipe problem. I will stress Pakistan. What do we face today in Pakistan? Why is the war continuing? It's because of the Pakistani military and the ISI. They're still fostering these sanctuaries that are churning out thousands of fanatics to cross the border. As long as that goes on, as long as those sanctuaries are breeding terrorists and insurgents to go across the border to fight the Americans, the Afghan army, police, etc., war will continue to tear Afghanistan. And this was Zia-ul-Haq's grand strategy from the very beginning. He set up this infrastructure along the frontier, which was based in radical Islamism. Osama bin Laden was there. Others were there actively participating in this. In the 90s, that whole infrastructure moved into Afghanistan after we lost interest. So as long as that was going, there was no chance for a negotiated outcome with Zia-ul-Haq especially. In Schultz's memoirs, there's a marvelous passage, I'm sure you've seen it, where Schultz and Reagan are on a call to Zia, and Reagan asks Zia, you've signed the Geneva Accords, you said you're going to stop interfering in Afghanistan. What are you going to do? And Zia said, that's not a big problem, because in our situation, Muslims can lie to non-Muslims. The U.S., Carter offered neutrality right after the Soviet went into Afghanistan, and this message was sent publicly through Tito. The European community also made an initiative, restore the Afghan buffer in Central Asia, which had worked between the British and Russian empires for about 80 years before the 78 coup. The old thing, Brezhnev Politburo, abruptly turned it down, but then Gorbachev returned to that in 86, but it was too late, as Dobrynin mentions in his memoir. I'm just going to briefly conclude with my period, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because this is the core of Artemy's book is before this. There was a chance to reach an agreement and stop the Afghan wars after the Soviet withdrawal. It would have required some arm twisting of Pakistan by the White House. But the bureaucracy in our country, like in the Soviet case, was hopelessly divided. On our side, state, we wanted to push a political settlement through the superpower dialogue at the various summits. It was President Bush and Baker on our side, and Artemy's mentioned the partners on Gorbachev and Shevardnadze on the other side. But the CIA was following a different contradictory policy of shoving arms to the radical Mujahideen groups, especially Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I estimate he got over 70% of the weaponry from us. We fought that in state, Kimmett, Baker, myself, and we never could stop that throughout this period. Within state, there were differences where the Soviet bureaucracy in state was arguing, let's give Gorbachev a olive branch or some help here because he's facing the hardliners in the Politburo, the KGB especially. And Afghanistan's not that important to us. It's very important to the Soviet Union. And others in state argued against that. So in the end, we decided to go for negative symmetry and just get out. And totally get out, forget about it, which I was against, and I described this I was very much for negative symmetry all along, but I was for staying engaged and using our great diplomatic weight to help end the wars of Afghanistan. But the idea within Bush's administration after September 13, 91, negative symmetry was consummated, was different. They just didn't want anything to do with Afghanistan. We outsourced U.S.-Afghan policy to Pakistan, which meant to the Pakistani army and the ISI, and you got the Taliban.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Let's open the floor. Please raise your hand, and when I call on you, please identify yourself for the record and your affiliation, if any. So the floor is open. Yes.
Thank you. David Zeeler, Office of the Historian, Department of State. I understand, Artemy, you're an alum of the Office of the Historian, so it's very nice to see great things that you do afterwards. Ambassador Thompson, you should know that I'm publishing your cable in the Foreign Relations volume. I'm currently working on a trilogy of Afghan volumes for the Foreign Relations of the United States series. I've completed the Carter-era volume, and I'm now into the first Reagan administration. And based on the documents that I've already looked at, I'd like both of you to answer sort of a general question I have about the period 1977 to 1981, the Carter administration. By the time you get to the Soviet intervention at Christmas 1979, immediately there's a lot of soul-searching within the administration about the meaning of what the Soviets did. And there's a basic division, and I don't even mean a division between two camps. It's even a division among individuals about what it means. On the one hand, it's so obviously a local response to a local problem. And on the other hand, the fact that you have the Soviet Union invading a non-Eastern Bloc country is so out of the norm for the strategic worldview of the foreign policy establishment in the United States that there isn't even a category of analysis to understand exactly what it was the Soviet Union was doing. And you see in the policy response of the United States this vacillation work out. On the one hand, you can look at what the Carter administration did in terms of politically the grain embargo, the boycotting of the Olympics, the covert action. You can see this as a tremendously muscular and strong response that, as far as we can tell, took the Soviet Union by surprise. And on the other hand, when you look at the dollar figures, now unfortunately a lot of this stuff remains classified, so I can't get into detail about that, but when you look at just how little in terms of money and arms the Carter administration actually put up, one wonders why they even bothered to do this at all. And so I guess the question is, sort of a counterfactual, but it's the question that I come away with in these documents, and that is, was there anything that the Carter administration could have done that would have compelled the Soviet Union to get out within the terms of the Carter administration before this became a problem of the Reagan and then George H.W. Bush administration?
Okay, and before turning the floor over, let me just add as a point of information, since you mentioned the ambassador's cable from March '79 about the Soviet response to the Herat uprising, that the translated minutes of those Politburo discussions are available through the Cold War International History Project website, especially Bulletin 8-9. But if you just click on Documents in Afghanistan, you can read those raw writing. And by the way, there's the related controversy. Some made the case that had warnings been made more sternly, could the U.S. have deterred the invasion in the first place, which is related to that. So,
thank you.
Artemy?
Sure. I'll just speak for the Soviet side, and maybe you can speak then for the U.S. side. But I think what would have gotten the Soviets out in 1980, we're especially talking about 1980, would have been, a guarantee that no arms were going to come in from Pakistan into Afghanistan or from any other source. Even that may not have been enough, because there is also the fact that internally there's a problem, and their position once they're in is, until we deal with this, we're not getting out, at least in that first year. After that, they start thinking more in terms of, we need to get out and then let things sort themselves out. So in that first year, the closest I think you could have gotten, and I don't think such a thing would have been possible, would be to say, we can help guarantee that no arms are going into the country to help the opposition, and nobody's getting trained.
And keep in mind, one thing that isn't, is probably, look, is the Sino-American normalization. They were very concerned about this in the context of the Sino-Soviet split, and the Chinese also helping the Mujahideen. Ambassador?
Exactly. That's a very good point. Thanks for running that cable and foreign relations review. I left Moscow in July, so I wasn't there afterwards when the situation changed and the Soviets did go in. I wasn't privy. I moved into Chinese language training in 7 years in China. So I wasn't privy to what the embassy sent, Toon's embassy, on the invasion. But I do know that we began warning the Soviets in March. Scranton, the governor of Pennsylvania, I was with him. I was his escort when he met Ponomaryov at a reception, and this was talking points we gave to him, and this was in March, and he warned the Soviets not to invade Afghanistan, and that cadence continued through the fall and right up to the invasion. But the decisions, for the reasons that Artemy mentioned, including the Sino-Soviet dispute and the Sino-American normalization, which was of enormous importance to the Soviets' feeling of being beleaguered during this period, contributed to the decision to invade, probably. So from the Carter administration's perspective, I think we have to remember always that perception sometimes becomes reality. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, they thought it was defensive, protecting what they thought was theirs, they had gained, etc. And they weren't going to let the Americans come in and move up to the Oxus, or Amudarya. But on the American side, there was really a feeling that this was unusual, as you said. In the post-World War II period, it's hard to find a situation where the Soviet Union moved its army out of this imperium that it created after the Second World War and invaded another country, and that this was seen as offensive, that it was heading towards the Indian Ocean, towards Baluchistan. You cross the deserts of Baluchistan, you're at the Indian Ocean. So they'll take time to consolidate like they did in Mongolia or other places, and then there'll be another push. And this also reflected 19th century Russian push and consolidate movements in Central Asia, into Siberia and into Central Asia. So perceptions in Washington, and Carter mentioned this too. He said step by step the Soviets are moving towards the Indian Ocean. He mentioned that publicly. So I think a lot of Americans really believe that.
Yeah, and again, just as a non-cleared news junkie watching at the time, the phrase that was repeatedly used, that you'll remember it, maybe younger audience, was they're taking advantage of the instability of the Iranian to seek a warm water port. Mm-hmm. And that it goes back to Peter the Great and supposed desire that they're exploiting the situation. And of course, this leads directly to the Carter Doctrine a few months later to try to prevent that from happening. Anyway, who would like to know next over here?
Yeah, I'm Cal Carnes. I'm retired from the intelligence community, ours. You talked a little bit about the split between the Soviet military and the KGB. Mm-hmm. A number of times. Could you be more specific? I've read where the GRU, Russian military intelligence, really didn't want to go into Afghanistan. The KGB did. Could you go into a little bit more detail on that?
The pre-invasion period, it's harder to speak about because I do suspect that the KGB played a very active role, probably beyond what they were being sort of, formally told to do within Afghanistan, and that probably contributed to the ultimate decision to intervene. But we do know that several of the top military people made their views known that they thought an intervention would be a mistake before they went in. After that, I mean, the split happens over any number of issues. But to give you one example that deals with the withdrawal period later, I mean, the military wanted to work mostly with Massoud. This comes back to something you were saying before, that Massoud didn't want to negotiate with the Soviets. Actually, he was pretty happy to negotiate with the Soviets. He didn't want to negotiate with Najibullah because the people around him, and this is what several people who worked with him told me, they were so angry about what happened to them and their families in 78, 79. And some of them had actually welcomed the revolution, or at least were tolerant of it, but that they couldn't deal with a regime that included the Najibullah anymore. But so Massoud was willing to work with the Soviet military, and they'd managed to have several truces along the way. And so then they were very much pushing to have him involved in a government with Najibullah. But Najibullah didn't want this, and the KGB felt that if Najibullah doesn't want something, then we can't force it upon him. The best chance for his survival is that we make him look as strong and well supported as possible. And Najibullah wanted to reach out to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and so the KGB said, well, that's who we're going to try to work with. That's somebody who can command respect here as well. And so they have extensive disagreements over that. Another point is the quote that you brought up from General Sotskov, who's one of the later military advisors there. It's about this attack on Massoud's territory that takes place, and it happens because Najibullah insists that it take place. He really wants the Soviets to to carry out one more major operation there before they withdraw. And this is at the same time almost that the Soviets are really trying to make a last effort to get Massoud into a government. And again, the split happens along these lines. The KGB says, you have to carry this out. This is part of our policy. The military is saying quite the opposite. How can we do this now? This is going to, go against everything we've been working for. On top of which, of course, they're also negotiating with Massoud because they're withdrawing partially, through his territory, and he does more or less keep the peace, at least while they're withdrawing. So, I mean, there are a few examples there.
Yeah, I just add that the Soviets could never count on Massoud to make any compromise on political settlement. That as far as Massoud was concerned, the regime was anathema, that could only be wiped out, and this effort by the Soviet Union to bring them together had no chance from the beginning. On Massoud negotiating with the Soviets, not only did it take place for these tactical reasons, to protect the Soviet withdrawal, and Ismail Khan did that in the West as well, but in 91, Massoud conducted a number of offensives that ran his territory right up to the Soviet border in Badakhshan and Takhar, and the only area Najib had was Faizabad, which is capital of Badakhshan, and the Soviets invited Massoud to negotiations on the border to regularize the border, and Massoud said, okay, but you have to move. There were a couple Soviet KGB outposts at Ishkashem and a couple other places inside Afghanistan, and Massoud said you have to take those checkpoints back across the border into Tajikistan, which the Soviets did, and then they had a protocol that regularized the border, which was kind of a slap in the face for Najib in Kabul, as you were mentioning.
Okay, and by the way, I'd refer you to the Cold War International History Project materials from the Mitrokin archive on some of the KGB activities prior to the actual invasion, including an abortive attempt to assassinate Amin without a full-scale invasion that failed earlier in December. Anyone else? Over here.
I'm Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. I was curious that the State Department, particularly with Jim Baker there, wasn't able to control the CIA. Why did that happen, and what were the implications?
That question was asked in an interview by Roy Gutman to Bob Oakley, that specific question. And Bob knew Secretary Baker very well. I think they went to Princeton together. At any rate, Bob's answer was he didn't he didn't give a direct answer. He said he probably felt that he didn't want to take on the CIA on this issue. I went over to the CIA and saw Dick Kerr and others and made the same points. Kimmett once gave an interview to the New York Times and made it public that the State Department did not appreciate this, the agency's support for the radicals in connection in cahoots with ISI. And you see what's happened today. Hekmatyar is trying to kill, working with ISI to kill Americans in Afghanistan, but we never got anywhere.
Okay. Actually, I have a question, and I'll ask it simply because to a lot of people who followed the war, this is a common belief, but I noticed in your book that you disagree. A lot of Americans believe the turning point came when the decision was made in 1985 to provide stingers to the Mujahideen. From your research in the Russian archives, you have a rather different view. Can you explain that?
Well, I can't take all the credit for my view. There's actually been some good work done by other scholars looking at the effect the stingers had, people who are much more comfortable with doing, studies of military activity, and showing that they weren't all that significant. From my point of view, it was talking to people from the Soviet military, people who were involved, looking at the debates on decision making. I mean, the stingers just don't really come up. And I think basically, yes, they're a problem. They do affect the Soviet dominance in the air, but the Soviets adjust by changing the altitude at which they fly, changing the use of special forces on the ground, and so forth. So no, I don't think that was a. And of course, then also the fact that they're trying to, they're thinking about getting out from 4 years before the stinger, also, I think supports that.
And one historiographical question, for the last 15 years, if a student had asked, what should I read about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, among the one book that always comes to mind is Out of Afghanistan by Cordovez and Harrison from 1995. I wonder if you could talk about how your inquiry goes beyond or differs or corroborates, their interpretation.
Yeah, well, it does corroborate a lot of the things they're saying. I mean, interestingly, Selling Harrison.
And I should explain, Cordovez was the UN.
Yeah, David Cordovez was the UN person, trying to coordinate this effort, what became the Geneva Accords. And Selling Harrison was a journalist who went through Siberia to Afghanistan to Moscow, and he was one of the journalists saying, from fairly early on, the Soviets are interested in getting out. And from what he told me, he, got into a bit of trouble for that because nobody wanted to take him seriously, and people criticized him very heavily. So I definitely corroborate that part of what they were saying. I think also I go broader and deeper on the non-diplomatic aspects of what was happening there. But they also talk about the fact, by the way, that the stingers weren't really a key motivation, or even a primary one. But again, I've worked with different sources and was, at least as time went on, was asking different questions than they were interested in. But it's an excellent book. I'd still recommend it.
Mm-hmm. Over here.
Yeah, Chia Chen from Bethesda, Maryland. To both of you, what the coming American withdrawal from Afghanistan can take a lesson from Russian withdrawal? Thank you.
Okay. And I should mention, by the way, Artemy has written in Foreign Policy, National Journal, and other publications about what analogies, lessons, et cetera, insights can be learned from his investigation for the current American predicament in Afghanistan. Artemy?
I actually never write about lessons because I think that's dangerous territory.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
Well, and also, I think the situation has changed dramatically. I think Afghanistan is a very different place than it was in 1979. I think the situation with Pakistan for the United States is obviously very different than it was for the Soviets. Central Asia is again a different thing today than it was then. But in terms of parallels, which I am more comfortable talking about, one thing that I seem to be seeing the Obama administration doing is going through this process of, we'll try better state building than the Bush administration did, and then sort of pulling back from it now and saying, well, actually, that's not going to get us where we want to in any shorter period of time. We've gone from refusing to talk to the Taliban at all to, it's basically clear now that everybody's trying to talk to the Taliban in some way or another. So these processes of let's just give this time to work, let's just give them time. I wonder at what point we'll just say, that's it. We've done everything we can. and it's time to pull back. And I guess if there's a lesson in that, I think it's it's better to get there sooner rather than later. But that's not very helpful.
And by the way, I should just add on this issue of parallels, or history not repeating itself but rhyming. When I started reading the Soviet documents on their relationship with Amin, and it reminded me nothing so much as reading about the documents from the American relationship with Diem and with Saigon during the Vietnam War. Just perpetual problem of trying to build an ally, that just cannot attain legitimacy enough to stand on its own.
Yeah, and let me add one thing to that. I mean, if there was a sort of positive lesson to learn there, I guess it would be that the Soviets didn't lose, because I think one of the reasons that there's an avoidance of trying to read about the Soviet history is because, they lost, and we don't want to compare ourselves to people who lost. And of course, in my view, the Soviets didn't lose, and they were fairly successful in what they did with Najibullah. But then the problem is, I don't think there's a Najibullah there today that you could try to do this with. Karzai is, he's much more like Karmal, and I think there probably was some serious consideration of getting rid of him about 2 years ago, except that you couldn't find anybody else. I don't think there's a figure that you could build a kind of Najibullah solution around today. And that also makes the negotiations with the Taliban actually probably a bit more dangerous. But again, not a very useful lesson, but at least something to keep in mind. Did you?
Over here.
Kent Hughes again. This may be perhaps more of a today than a yesterday question, but how much is Pashtun nationalism involved? I know the Afghan government has never, ever recognized the Durand Line, and it's certainly permeable at the very least with families on both sides and so forth. Is that a reality, and does that mean that because of the past there has to be a Pashtun dominance of some sort, however light, if Afghanistan is going to hold together?
I'm not enough of an Afghan expert to really tell you that, but what I will say is that this is the conclusion that the Soviets came to, and certainly the KGB came to, and that was one of the reasons they really wanted to support Najib, and that they were more supportive of the link between him and Hekmatyar rather than a link between him and Massoud. I think, of course, it's true that in modern Afghan history it has been, pushed and dominated, but at the same time, you have to be careful, I think, of being too simplistic about these ethnic divisions and about what kind of arrangement can be made and isn't possible. But I would point you to the work of somebody like Antonio Giustozzi, both for the historical aspects of this and for the contemporary aspects of this. Also, Thomas Barfield's excellent book. It's the first real book on the history of Afghanistan that we've had in about 30 years. That's quite good.
The Taliban are more of a Pashtun movement than they are in terms of recruiting, raising money, cooperating with local populations, whether it's in the Pashtun homeland, so to speak, in the south and east, or with Pashtun ink spots or larger than ink spots in the north. You'll always find pro-Taliban sentiment there because they are viewed as a Pashtun movement, which is why the ISI created the Taliban out of another shura that the ISI created during the Soviet war. They just turned them over, the same leadership, and after Gulbuddin Hekmatyar could not carry the banner of Islamic extremism and carrying jihad into not only Afghanistan but Central Asia and beyond, then they rolled out the Taliban.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If not, let me invite you again to purchase Artemy Kalinovsky's new book, either directly from Harvard University Press or Amazon or whatever search engine you want to try. And with that, let me thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Artemy and Ambassador Thompson.